Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this new sound effect, and we don't really need to worry about stopping it quick because I don't think we'll be sued by a merry-go-round, but we could be sued by a merry-go-round. This is the newest theme show on the bathtub, which is it's called Short Story Roundabout. Short Story Roundabout, which is basically just like when I go into kind of loops where I'm working on a lot of different reading stuff for different pieces I'm working on. So every day in the bathtub, I just read a short story or two by different writers, and I kind of go from one writer to another. So I have like two or three, four books on the roundabout at a time, and I thought I'd just talk about those story collections I've been reading for the past week, which I've really enjoyed, maybe a week or 10 days. I started Isaac Bashevis, the singer, a few weeks ago, and I have to say he is one of the great short story writers. Every time you finish a short story of his, it's like when you were a kid and you watched The Twilight Zone and you had to run to school to tell everybody what the story was about. I feel that way almost every short story in this book. I mean, it has lots of fantastic stories. So many of his most fabulistic stories with like there's ghosts and jinns and all sorts of weird happenings. And then there's also the opposite, which is the title story, the Seance, which is about a con woman who runs fake seances in her New York apartment, and a guy, an old Jewish man, who hangs out with her because she keeps him company. There's so many wonderful stories in this. The last one's very long, called The Letter Writer. I just finished that last week probably. It's about a guy who works in some horrible New York publishing house, and he has no friends really. He's quite lonely. There's lots of lonely New Yorkers, and they're all from old country where they, had horrible youths, and they come to New York and they're just barely getting by. And he basically develops relationships with his only relationships are through writing letters to women he meets, and I think he meets them in lovelorn columns, or they write letters to different newspapers, and he picks them out and starts writing them and gets in correspondences. This old man, and eventually one of the women who he meets has to come meet him. There's so many good stories here. Um, sometimes I forget them so quickly after I've read them. The Brooch is really good. There's an incredible story called The Parrot, which is about a man who loves it. He has a parrot that he loves, and he loves his parrot, and he gets involved with this woman, and there becomes a kind of a three-way. I don't want to say it's not a three-way love affair, but it's definitely the parrot is intervening, and the woman starts to get jealous of the parrot, and it's just a brilliant story. There's another one, The Needle. There's a story called The Needle. They all sound almost like old folk tales, but they seem very original at the same time. One's called The Needle, which is it's almost like a fairy tale. This woman wants to find the perfect wife for her son. So she goes to a seamstress, and she asks her for the cheapest thing they sell, which is just a needle. And she just causes her all sorts of grief as a saleswoman to see if she's kind and patient enough to marry her son. And so she goes to a few places, and that's just the beginning of the story. I haven't really told you the endings of any of these stories. Every story is very different, very Chekhovian, but with many more fabulous elements. And then he will go straight to a non-fabulous type story where there's no fantasy at all, without any shift in the sense of the reality of the characters. Wonderful book of stories, The Seance. I recommend his short stories to everybody. The other one, I've been reading this off and on for a few months. We talked about C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, married couple, came to California and in the 40s, and I wanted to I think Kuttner was going to go into teaching. They went to UCLA or something. They had written individually, so C.L. Moore had published stories in the 30s in Weird Tales. She was very much admired by two very sensible readers, H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. They both thought she was great, and she was really good. So before she met Kuttner, she wrote these kind of dark fantasies, very romantic, very kind of lush atmosphere. They're sometimes on kind of far distant planets like a Clark Ashton Smith story, but at the same time there's sometimes fantasy. There's also that she does this kind of Jirl of Jory, which is a woman sword and sorcery heroine, but her adventures are almost psychological, where she kind of goes into these dark spaces and journeys through these kind of monstrous labyrinths to do something or other. Really, really unusual stories. And I had never really read C.L. Moore by herself until recently. And if you read this book, almost all the stories she claims, except for two of the most famous, No Woman Born and Vintage Season, almost all of them were before she and Kuttner basically collaborated on everything. That's basically the story it sounds like. It sounds like everything that came out after they got married, they worked on each other's stories. So you get two of the most, for example, you see Vintage Season. I've seen that story. That's one of the most famous stories that they wrote. They wrote on, one of their collaborative names was Lewis Paget. You'll see them in old science fiction anthologies. Lewis Paget is C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner. But even when Henry Kuttner published a story under his name, or she published one under hers, they were usually collaborating, often collaborating. Vintage Season has been published in a Kuttner anthology, and now it's published in a C.L. Moore anthology, and you'll see it in places where it's Lewis Paget, etc. These are the two most famous stories in this book, and the ones that are kind of considered the classics were good, and I did really like them. Vintage Season's a very interesting story about time travelers coming to this person's house to witness an event, which you don't know about till the end. It's a classic story. I've never read it before this. And No Woman Born, which is about a woman who's been kind of modified by technology until she's hardly a woman and hardly a machine. And both of them are very good stories. I didn't like them as much as the pre-marriage, the purer C.L. Moore stories. There was a story, the best story I read out of here for a while was a long story called Demon, or Damon. And that's kind of a brilliant story about a guy who's almost like an idiot savant in a way, and he can see spirits in the world, and he can see the spirits that are behind other people. And that's the beginning of the story. I don't want to tell you too much because it goes in so many interesting directions, and it's a beautiful story, really strange. He ends up on some island. I won't give any more about that, but I really enjoyed this book, and I love Kuttner as well, but I'm kind of really interested more and more in who C.L. Moore was before she married Kuttner, because the kind of comic Kuttner eye sort of comes into her work, which just kind of waters down some of my favorite parts about C.L. Moore. Very good writer. If you like old SF, you should read it. Finally, the past few days have just been delighted to read. Again, I've talked about de Maupassant often. I just basically pick up anthologies that I don't remember reading, and they all have different combinations of his stories. This is one of two Oxford paperbacks, translated and with an introduction by David Coward, and it's still in print, I'm pretty sure. I think the introduction is great. It's a 15-20 page introduction that tells you a lot about de Maupassant. And this collection, the selection of stories in here, there's always some that I've read before. This has the Horla, the great vampire story, and then it has a few other stories that I've read definitely before. I've read a Farm Girl Story, which is a really kind of sad and kind of warm story. Then lots of very short stories. I'm about halfway through it. I read 2 or 3 of these every day and just have a great time with every single one of his stories. He goes from incredibly dark stories. There's one about some peasant in the countryside who goes off slaughtering Prussian soldiers during the war. And he just goes out at night and just slaughters them. It's about a 4-page story, 6-page story. And it's kind of brilliant and funny and horrifying at the same time. There's some really dark stories. I read a horrible story this morning, probably one of the darkest, about again, he talks about his peasant anger, really poor people who get angry at their animals, and this kid has to take care of a horse, and it's a horrifying story, and yet just such a beautifully written story. So many stories in here that I loved about some people, undercutting the kind of heroicness of soldiers. The soldiers are always kind of ridiculous, and one story after another that I loved. I can't even remember some of these plots now. The famous story, which I must have read 4 or 5 times, is A Day in the Country. And it is one of the great de Maupassant stories, like the Horla, which is about a family that has little money and they decide to spend it on a day in the country. And there's a mother and her daughter who get basically seduced by these 2 kind of local yokels. They're local yokels. And yet the story takes you somewhere you're a little surprised by at the end. There's also a wonderful Renoir film of that, a short film by Renoir about that terrific story. Every story I've read in here is great. It's an interesting one because there's a lot more of the shorter ones. And I would really recommend this volume. I think of all the volumes I've talked about or have read over the years, this one particularly is good to show the variety of de Maupassant's stories. And the introduction helps a lot too. So I'm going to be content. This is going to stay on the... This is staying on the Roundabout, and the other ones are going to go off the Roundabout. Those are all finished. And we'll do some more of these because I have kind of a yen just to keep reading short story writers for a while. Happy bathing. Stay out of trouble. Stay out of the shower. And we'll see you soon.